We all like to think we know when we're being lied to. When you're buying a used lawnmower off Facebook Marketplace, it's not too hard to figure out if the seller is being honest with you. It gets a lot harder when we're talking about politics. Misleading information and flat-out disinformation is nothing new in Canadian politics, and all parties do it. Yes, Liberals, I'm talking to you as well. And even though all parties do it, it seems that Conservatives are putting out more. There's plenty of research to suggest that Conservatives are more susceptible to fake news or misinformation and are more likely to buy into conspiracy theories, as well as more likely to share it all on social media. But why is that? And what can we all do to recognize our own biases, think critically about what we're reading and listening to, and have an open mind about what version of the truth we're willing to believe? That's what this video is about. We'll look at some lessons from actual research, talk about some examples of misinformation, and try to get us all to at least be reasonable when talking about important issues, and not default to nut-bar statements about the World Economic Forum implanting surveillance chips into the COVID vaccine. Okay, right off the bat, I need to apologize to Conservative viewers. A lot of the research and articles I'll talk about in this video show that while we're all more apt to believe the politicians and others we like, and more likely to think other people are just lying to us, there's a lot that suggests that you, as a Conservative, are more vulnerable to misinformation. But I'll start off with a piece that shows, regardless of what your political leanings, you'll be more susceptible to believe things that aren't true if you're already pretty confident in your ability to spot the stuff that's wrong. There was an article published by Forbes in July 2023 that talked about this exact point. It highlighted work at the University of Miami and quoted the lead author's comment about why he undertook this research. "My main interest is figuring out why reasonable people believe dumb things, which happens to all of us more times in our lives than we'd like to admit. This research showed that there are some who might instantly believe false information based on their gut feelings. There are others who might talk themselves into believing the misinformation after spending some time thinking about it, and then there are still others who spend time thinking about it and are able to correctly identify the information as false. You want to be in this last category." The researchers in the Forbes article said, "The overconfidence an individual may have in their ability to spot misinformation actually makes them even more likely to fall for it, because it prevents them from engaging in the type of thinking they'd need to do to spot it in the first place." So, now that we know we're all susceptible because overconfidence makes us a bit blind to other facts, and Conservatives may fall victim to misinformation more often, let's talk about how Pierre Poilievre uses that to position himself as Canada's political savior. Now, you have to admit, Mr. Poilievre is fairly media savvy. He produces some slick videos, and yes, I get it. He's got a production team that's way better at this than I am, cut me some slack. He uses numbers that seem to be telling viewers the right picture, but if you scratch just below the surface, you can see that the picture he's painting is misleading. His social media messages tend to make statements that take current issues, and he twists the narrative to convince the reader it's the Liberals' fault. There's lots of examples of this, including PEI potato fungus, causes of inflation, or Justin Trudeau's role in housing prices. In one of Poilievre's videos, Detonation, he says at the start that Canada has racked up $10 trillion in debt, combining government and personal and corporate debt, which makes it look like Canada is swimming in debt. The Canadian government does not have $10 trillion in debt. Has federal government debt gone up since Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister? Yes, it has. Did it go up when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister? Yes, it did. Will it go up if Pierre Poilievre becomes Prime Minister? I'll bet it likely will, despite what he tells us. In the Detonation example, the framing of household debt alone is misleading. As a percentage of assets, Canada's household debt is just a smidge over 15%. Which is where it has been for most of the last 30 years. But Poilievre wants you to think that there's a more sinister story and that it's all Justin Trudeau's fault. Connecting this back to who does believe what Mr. Poilievre says, there was some polling done by Ecos Research discussed in a Walrus article in February 2023. The poll was about disinformation in politics and found 70% of fully disinformed voters, those who scored high on all disinformation indicators in the study, backed Pierre Poilievre. 66% of Conservatives, according to the Ecos poll, say they never trust the government to do the right thing. Wow. compared with 8% of New Democrats and 4% of Liberals. And sure, there are some legit criticisms of that Ecos poll. The Walrus article talks about those falling prey to disinformation and states their embrace of conspiracy theories reflects a much higher consumption of disinformation, and they're attracted to the idea of a strong leader who will get things done. Researchers call this affective polarization. Voters with opposing ideologies harden in their views and become less tolerant and respectful of one another. It means fewer points of compromise are possible, and debates become demonizing, resentment-driven, conspiracy-fueled, instead of working together on the problems. The basic theory underpinning the explanation of these results is that certain personality types seek order when faced with an exaggerated sense of an external threat. And Pierre Poilievre is very good at exaggerating the current threat in Canada, and very frequently, constantly, blames the Prime Minister for it all. This theory is also called the authoritarian reflex, and conditions are ripe in Canada. A lot of people are tired of Justin Trudeau, tired of the ruling Liberals. There's a backlash against increasingly permissive society and a perceived collapse of racial, religious, gender, and sexual hierarchies. When all of these things align, people who are susceptible to misinformation will gravitate to politicians like Pierre Poilievre, who don't really have any solutions, at least not that they're willing to talk about. They are powered by rage and a sense that the Liberals are trying to keep them down, when really a not too deep look at the Liberal ideas shows the exact opposite. Supporters of the Liberal and NDP parties in Canada may tend to think that if we just show people the facts, it will change their minds. In fact, there's a great account on Twitter that goes all in on fact-checking Pierre Poilievre called Pierre is Lying to You. After each session in the House of Commons, they dissect Mr. Poilievre's comments and publish the number of times he didn't speak the truth. And they provide references. For instance, on May 1st, 2024, they reported that Mr. Poilievre told 84 lies during question period. But does any of the fact-checking actually matter? There was another article on Forbes in August 2023 that discussed a series of experiments involving supporters of far-right political parties. And no, I don't think Canada's Conservative Party can be labeled far-right just yet, but Pierre does seem to be okay with hanging out with extremists. These experiments weren't based in Canada, but the findings were interesting. In the US, Republicans who voted for Trump and self-identified as Trump supporters didn't care about Twitter fact checks and were willing to share the misinformation anyway. When they choose to share misinformation, they're likely doing so because they view it as a way to signal to other like-minded extremists they belong to the same social and political group and address their need for social belonging. So while it's important to correct misinformation to show that the person spreading it is wrong, for a certain portion of the susceptible audience, correcting the facts won't matter. There's lots of other work going on to study misinformation. There was a report called the Social and Digital Misinformation Report, published in 2019 by Simon Fraser University, looking at how disinformation affects Canadian democracy. The Center for Countering Digital Hate in the US published a report in January 2024 detailing their work on climate denialism and how tactics are being shifted to derail climate action by telling people the solutions don't work, now that they've lost the argument that climate change isn't real. And I haven't even talked about Tim Caulfield's work. He's a misinformation guru at the University of Alberta, whose books such as Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything focuses on health and wellness crap that you see all over the place. And there's the Canadian Election Misinformation Project, co-managed by McGill University and the University of Toronto, that looked at the issue of misinformation and disinformation during the 2021 election. Their report, published in March 2022, found that there was widespread mis- and disinformation during the 21 election campaign, but they determined it actually had minimal impact on the outcome. That's good. Surprising, but good. Because we all see how disinformation used by conservatives in the US sow doubt in the minds of the susceptible about the security, accuracy, and fairness of the electoral process after the last presidential election, Elections Canada is trying to get ahead of that here. They've created an online disinformation tool. Now, it focuses on the electoral process rather than the stuff the political parties will spew out, but still, It's called the Facts website, and it launched in January 2024. So what can we all do to get better at sifting through all the crap and making informed decisions about who we're going to support in the next election? One of those Forbes articles I mentioned earlier about the University of Miami work talked about practicing intellectual humility. That's accepting the fact that you could be wrong, and make a habit of pumping your mental brakes when you encounter new information. They also called it productive doubt, which is a skeptical mindset that leads you to check sources, do some factual digging, and verify claims rather than just blindly accepting them. In one of the other articles, the author lists a couple of questions that every engaged citizen should ask themselves. Have the concepts of my truth and your truth caused irreversible damage to our ability to be objective in our political leanings? And is it possible to have polarized views on political issues and, as a society, still get along? The bottom line is that Pierre Poilievre desperately wants to be Prime Minister, so he's likely willing to say anything he thinks will make you vote Conservative. Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister and desperately wants to stay Prime Minister, so he's susceptible to the same motivations, although, as we've seen from all this research, Poilievre may be more likely to play fast and loose with the facts. Every election has big consequences, and every single vote, yours, mine, each one is important. You'll feel better about which way you've gone with your vote if you know that you haven't been duped into believing something that isn't true.